Hello, everyone. This is the Asian American Herald, a new media network that airs via live stream on Facebook and YouTube twice a week. I'm Himani Gupta Carlson, host of the Thursday evening show. So I'd like to open our show tonight with a weekly tribute to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who are the original caretakers of much of upstate New York, where the Asian American Herald is based. And in making this tribute, I acknowledge myself as a settler on these territories, and I thank the Haudenosaunee for providing me with shelter. Today, I welcome Virginia State Senator Ghazala Hashmi. Senator Hashmi was born in Hyderabad in the early 1960s and immigrated to the United States with her family when she was 5 years old. She grew up in a small town in Georgia in the years immediately following the civil rights movement and followed her family's footsteps through higher education, earning a bachelor's degree in English at Georgia Southern University and a PhD in American literature from Emory University. She has served as a professor and administrator for more than 30 years and has received many awards for her efforts to establish policies promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. And she ran for office for the first time in 2019, and she won. And her victory made her the first Muslim to serve in the Virginia State Senate. And it also helped flip the Senate in favor of the Democrats. So, Senator Hashmi, you clearly have had a distinguished career, and it's really an honor to welcome you on our show. So, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. And so, before we dive into politics, I was actually wondering if you could tell us a little more about your family and your background, and just tell us maybe a bit about your childhood in Hyderabad and the circumstances under which your family came to the US in 1969.
Well, thank you for that question. I have a few memories of my very early childhood in Hyderabad, but certainly as many of us from the South Asian diaspora have experienced, I did travel back to Hyderabad twice while I was growing up and got to spend some time with my grandparents there. But my parents were originally in India, of course, before partition. And then after partition, my father had immigrated to Pakistan, and he was a college professor in Karachi, and my mother had joined him. But in 1964, he received a fellowship to be one of the first international students to come to the University of South Carolina and work on his PhD in international relations. And so he accepted that offer. It was a hard decision for both of my parents. My mother was pregnant with me at that time. And so she returned back to Hyderabad to stay with her parents and traveled with my older brother, who was just 2 years old at the time. And so my dad came to the US and worked on his doctorate for the next 5 years. And so I stayed with my mom and my brother with my maternal grandparents for those 5 years. And I think it was a really important grounding place for me to really feel connected to my larger extended family. I know when I returned later as a teenager and got to visit them again, it was wonderful to see people who actually remembered my childhood and my growing up years. But I met my dad for the first time when I was 5 years old, landed in Savannah Airport, and I remember meeting him and getting to know him as well as the new culture that we were stepping into. And so I grew up in Statesboro, Georgia, a small college town just outside of Savannah.
Wow. What was it like seeing your father at Savannah Airport for the first time?
It was from my memories, it was pretty incredible. I know I had built this kind of mythology in my little head about my father, and I had always longed to meet him. And so it was he fit the mythology. It was wonderful to see him, and I know he had toys and gifts ready for both me and my brother, and was really happy to see us again. He and my mother hadn't seen each other for 5 years, and back then there was no such thing as transatlantic phone calls all the way to Hyderabad. They were far too expensive, certainly, and so they had not even heard each other's voice. They had survived on blue aerograms that were traveled for weeks to get to each other. So I know it was a tremendous challenge for them, but we were so fortunate to have loving parents who really did everything that they could for us.
Yeah. Wow. It's very, very amazing. And we were talking a little before the show started about the aerograms, and I also remember the difficulties of those phone calls and having to kind of call the operator to get the operator to make the call, and then there would just be so much static that all you could really do was say hello, 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 hello,
Right.
very, very quickly, and that was sometimes just enough just to hear even a broken strain of a voice.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. It
Yeah.
was very challenging.
So, like you, I'm also a child of the 1960s and grew up as the daughter of immigrants from kind of the Delhi area in northern India. And I grew up in the Midwest, primarily in Indiana. And so I kind of know what it was like to be one of just a few Indian kids around. But you ended up kind of in a different kind of area of the United States, in Georgia, in a small town, not Atlanta, not really Savannah, as a 5-year-old who'd already had some experience living in Hyderabad. And so I'm wondering, what do you recall most about your childhood, and what was that experience like?
So that's a great question. I have really distinct memories of understanding quite early that I was different. And you're right there. I believe there was just one South Asian family when we first moved to India, and then they left. The father found a position at Howard University in Washington, and so we were the only South Asian family, and my mom was the only one who wore a sari to
Wow.
school events and to go grocery shopping. And so I remember feeling very different. And I remember teachers asking questions such as, have you ever worn shoes before you came to the United States? Did you live in a house? And so feeling very treated as an exotic. But for me, what was really interesting, and again, I was quite conscious of this, is the fact that the issues in this little town were really divided along racial lines between black and white. And it was a challenge, I think, to the status quo to have a brown family there,
Yeah.
and to have a brown family that was headed by, an educated man, a college professor. And so there was segregation in the system, the school system, in housing, even in our doctors' waiting rooms. And we were in this kind of gray zone as
Yeah.
a brown family. We were able to go to a school that was primarily for white children. My parents were able to purchase a house, though they did it tentatively, in a white neighborhood. We were allowed to sit in the white waiting room, and I saw the unfairness of that and the injustice that you had populations that were racially discriminated, even though these individuals and these families had spent generations in that town, had farmed that local community, and had worked really to build that town, and they could not enjoy the privilege that my family, as brand newcomers, were able to do. So it was a interesting childhood in that regard. But I certainly had friends who were across the racial spectrum, and they're dear friends. I stay in touch with my early childhood friends to this day.
Oh, that's really wonderful. Yeah, I kind of lost touch with a lot of my early childhood friends until Facebook brought me back to them.
Exactly.
And so now, I am back in touch with them. And I was going to ask you, how did you kind of have friends on both sides of the divide. What kind of bridge formed that enabled that?
I think the fact that I didn't see myself as either white or black allowed me to develop strong friendships with members of both communities. And I would like to think that both my brother and I, and later our younger sister who joined us, were able to bring communities together in that way. Because when we organized friendships and had activities and events, I know we certainly included everybody in that mix. And for some people, it may have been the opportunity then to reach across racial divides. And when you're younger and not as steeped in the issues of racism that seem to permeate our society, then children have greater flexibility, a greater willingness to adapt. And we certainly all played together once the schools were desegregated, and had friendships that were really wide ranging, in whether it's academic clubs or after school activities and so forth. We did not divide ourselves in as clear racial lines as the adult society around us had done.
Yeah. I'm also curious about the religion, because if being a South Asian was a very kind of exotic, as you had put it earlier, peculiar thing, I think maybe being a Muslim might have been even more so. And I'm wondering, but at the same time, you were in the South right in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, and kind of like the feelings of Black power. And I'm wondering how much being part of a Muslim community also helped with friendships, maybe across the racial lines.
I had no Muslim friends. There was no Muslim community.
Okay.
We were the only Muslim family, and so in that sense, I really. I knew my friends' religions pretty well. I accompanied some to churches. We had a small population of Jewish friends as well in that area. But in essence, I've thought about this often since we were the only Muslim family. Observing Ramadan or Eid was a very solitary affair,
Yeah.
and really our only guidance that we had as far as religious instruction came from our parents. And what I think that helped me to do, and I think the same is for my brother and sister, it really liberated us in many ways from perhaps the cultural traditions that permeate religion, and allowed us to understand the religion itself, the scripture, and the essential teachings. And so a lot of my own personal practices in the faith are not bound by the ways in which the faith may be observed in a cultural context, but it's rather distilled into the spiritual practice by itself. And that was liberating, I think, in a lot of ways to be able to do it that.
Yeah.
But in the South, a lot of people, or I think in America in general, a lot of people really didn't know much about Islam in the 60s and 70s. And it's really not until 1979, when the Iranian hostage crisis occurred, that's when it became a challenge to be a Muslim and to be stigmatized and to feel somewhat othered in the community. And that's when I think some certain shifts began to occur. But prior to that, it was fairly routine to be a Muslim in Statesboro, Georgia.
Yeah. So I actually want to move into kind of asking you, just because I'm a fellow academic myself, I'm curious about your dissertation topic, which focused on William Carlos Williams and his works in the American Grain and Patterson, both of which are significant American texts literary texts, but aren't, really widely known. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little about Williams, his texts, and really what drew you to them and motivated you to want to study them.
Thank you so much. You're the first person that's ever asked me that question, so I really appreciate it because
I was
it gives me
if you
it gives me a chance to talk about Williams. And I think there was a much more greater prominence around Williams and some of the poets of the 1920s, 1930s than perhaps we see in our academic departments now in English. But this was 30 years ago when I wrote my dissertation. What drew me to this is really at the heart of what informs my approach to government at this point too. So when I first started graduate school, I went with the intention that I was going to be focusing on British literature. I grew up enthralled with Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters. And so it's the British culture and the British tradition that really, really shaped my love of literature. I had a triggering moment when my first year in grad school, that first Christmas holiday, I actually got a chance to go to England to be in London for a week or so. And at that point, I realized just the experience of being South Asian in England was so different than being South Asian in America. I really, really felt very much alienated. I felt othered. I remember feeling like a second-class citizen in a way that I'd never felt in this country. And I realized that this was a culture and a people that I really did not know as an American, and I didn't feel the deep empathy that I had felt through the literary tradition. And so when I came back from that experience, that spring semester, I swung everything that I planned to do into the focus of American literary tradition. And I deliberately chose Williams, and particularly his text in The American Grain and Patterson, because Williams is trying to articulate a concept of what it means to be an American, and where the idea, the ideology, the philosophical development of Americanness, or an American consciousness, an American literary tradition, an American language, where all of that comes from. And so my dissertation sought to trace those elements, especially through poetry of Walt Whitman, through the philosophy of Emerson and Thoreau, and through the founding text of the political thought, such as the Constitution. And so I was really seeking, I think, in a way, to define what it meant to be an American to myself, and coming into a consciousness of my own American identity. So that was part of the process, and it really grounded me to then, as I ran for office, to be able to talk about the America that I knew, the America that I love deeply through this philosophical and literary tradition.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because so much of American discourse is about excluding the other, the brown foreign body that never will actually fit into some idea of the American. And so I am curious how you found yourself to be an American through reading these particular texts. Or did you not, maybe?
I did, actually. And it was I drew from these texts when I ran for office and in all of my speeches, and it really resonated with so many people and the audiences that I was talking to. So, how these particular texts help shape me is the idea, especially that comes from a poet like Walt Whitman, who, when he writes basically the Song of America, the Epic of America, and he's trying to define how large it is and how profound and deep these currents of democratic ideology run. And he has these beautiful lines where he's talking about, I hear the song of America, I hear Americans singing, and he talks about the accents of the Kentuckian or the Georgian or the folks from New York, and he talks about the kind of urgency and energy in New York City, Manhattan, which he deeply loved. And it's that full scope of the American song that really was powerful to me. And so I would speak about that in my campaign speeches. And then I also always spoke about Langston Hughes, who picks up on the tradition of Walt Whitman and the Song of America. But Hughes takes that song and makes it his own. And he dared to say, in 1920, as a Black man, he said, I too sing America. And that one little line, I too sing America, laying claim to a country that had refused to acknowledge his humanity, laying claim to that idea of democracy that was what draws us all, and really what makes America, or the idea of America, as powerful as it is. And so I said in my speech, I too sing the Song of America. I dare to claim it for myself. And I always ended my speeches with that idea that we are, as diverse as we are bound together by our fundamental belief and love for these shared democratic values. And these transcend race, transcends our different identities that we have.
Yeah. I was really struck by a quote, and now as I'm listening to you talk, that quote is starting to make a lot more sense. This was a quote on your website. I realized I had a choice. I could remain unheard, unseen, unrepresented, or I could speak out, be visible, and dare to claim for myself and other marginalized communities the right to full participation in our democracy. And then Ghazala Hashmi is an American name. And so you've told us a bit about that, tracing it to In the American Grain and also to Langston Hughes. But I'm wondering if you could just kind of unpack that for us a little bit more.
That line, and became the tagline for my campaign, Ghazala Hashmi is an American name. That line really resonated with people, and it kind of just came out of the blue. In one of my earlier speeches, I was talking to a small group of women, and I blurted it out, and people, they started crying, because they understood really the kind of intense power behind laying that claim to an identity that has been denied, really. I think all of us who feel othered by virtue of our name or by virtue of how we look or our skin color, we all identify with that. So there was two real powerful reasons why I use this as my tagline. And the first was, of course, as a response to so many people in this country who continue to see marginalized communities as un-American. And we're especially seeing this right now with the rise of anti-Asian hate across this country, tragically. This refusal to identify Asian Americans or members of the AAPI community as Americans, even though so many of us have been here for generations. So I really needed folks in my audience, and my district is primarily Caucasian, and then about 30% African American. I really don't have an immigrant community in my district. I needed my constituents to see and understand me as an American, to see that I am very much a part of this country. And so that was a critical part of that tagline. But the second part of that tagline was really for children such as myself who had grown up here and who had longed to find identity in this country. I'm not sure if I'm sure you have experienced this actually. I remember as a child watching TV or reading a newspaper, and if I ever saw a South Asian character or someone highlighted in the news or a byline of a South Asian, I would get so excited that there was someone that actually looked and represented and someone I could relate to. I needed children around me to understand that their identity is just as American as their other classmates and friends. And I had so many mothers come and tell me that their son or daughter loved that, and that they would go around and say the same phrase, but they would insert their own name. They would put in their name and say, this is an American name. And I was so glad to have that kind of impact on the folks that were around me.
Yeah, that's really cool. It reminds me very much of the walls and mirrors idea in literature, which kind of, basically essentially says children need mirrors so they can mirrors and windows. I think they need windows so they can look outside to see other things besides their own experience, but they also need mirrors so they can see people that look like themselves, so they have something that they can emulate as they go forward.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So, it's fairly amazing to me to see an incumbent get defeated by a first-time candidate, and particularly an incumbent who was part of a state's dominant party, as well as being, a white individual and a male. And I'm wondering, just how did you do it? How did you build that network and organize volunteers and get people to vote for you?
It was certainly a challenge. And when I first started running for office, I was told by my own some party members that I was not electable. I did not have that political network. I had to learn how to raise money, which is so essential for any political campaign. And I really had to reach a broad audience. And so it was a challenge. One thing I was actually turned out to be fortunate is that I had a primary. It was a three-way primary. And I was running against someone who was establishment. She had run 2 races already, and her name was well known, and she'd done a good job already in terms of being very engaged in politics. And so having that as a challenge was important, because then you prove yourself through the primary race and then are able to build on that momentum. But I think what I really worked hard to do is to lean into the kind of communities and coalitions my husband and I had already established. We'd lived in this district for 30 years. Our daughters had gone to school here, and we had raised them. And we had a pretty broad network of friends, both through work, our colleagues. We had, I had been a Girl Scout troop leader. I had been really active in my girls' schools and their classes. And we kept up with not just our girls' friends, but their parents as well. We had friendships and our neighbors. And so we started to build on those coalitions. And then there are just amazing volunteers in Central Virginia. And once we were able to reach out, connect them, share the message that we had, it just kind of built that momentum. And my message was built around the issues that this community really cares about and that I care about. Bread and butter issues like education. I'd been working in the community college system for 20 years. I knew those issues. I'd worked with the people who had housing insecurity, food insecurity, lack of access to jobs. And so I focused on those concerns: healthcare, common sense gun safety, reproductive rights for women. These are the issues that really resonate with voters. And it was important to show where my values were.
Yeah, and it looked like it did have an effect, obviously. And taking office then in early 2020, probably means that you were hit head on very quickly with, the issues we've grappled with over the past 2 years, the ongoing pandemic, all of the racialized violence, Republican allegations of election fraud. And I'm just wondering how that has shaped the work that you've been doing legislatively over since the time that you took office.
You're right. It's been a whirlwind. Right after my election, I had to dive to build up my office staff and get ready for the first session, which was in. So I was elected in November, and then in January, our first session started. And we had a great session. I was learning the ropes and getting acclimated. But, when we adjourned in March, it was the same day that the governor declared a state of emergency because of COVID. And I had to pivot very quickly. My staff had to learn how to work remotely. And suddenly we had a crisis on our hands. And as a new legislator, that was a challenge. And my staff is all new and fresh as well. So learning how to direct constituents' concerns to various resources in state government, whether first it was, of course, the PPE issues, COVID testing, unemployment concerns. It's just been one challenge after another. But I've got great folks working with me, and we've been able to develop constituent services, which was really important. Then Richmond became the site of serious civil unrest right in May and June with the George Floyd murder. And we had nonstop protest basically since the end of May all the way through August. And with that, plus the pandemic, it was quite a bit. But our first special session then we had in August, and at that point we focused on police reform, criminal justice reform. I carried a bill for civilian review boards, and we were able to pass that, as well as other major police reforms. So no-knock warrants, making sure that the rights of individuals are protected, demilitarizing our police. All of those were significant efforts. And then special session lasted all the way through November. And then we moved into our second full session this January. So this January, I worked on eviction-related issues, helping to put a moratorium in place, and focused on bills such as the farm to food banks, making sure our local farmers are supported and that they're also able to contribute to our charitable food organizations. So there's just been a lot of work around housing, around food security, around education, and it's been a whirlwind, but it's been such good work. I've just been really privileged and honored to be able to have an impact and make changes that are meaningful for people.
Well, that's really awesome. I was going to ask you, was this a 2-year term or a 4-year term? I wasn't really sure about the structure of the Virginia Assembly.
Yeah. So the Virginia Senate is a 4-year term, and so I have two additional years. Our House of Delegates, who are 100 members, have 2-year terms, and so all 100 seats are up for re-election this November, and then the 40 Senate seats will come up in the 2024. The election will be 2023.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward, hopefully, to seeing you running again, because it looks like you are hitting the ground running and doing some great stuff. We're almost out of time, so I just want to really ask one final question, which is really about the presence of Asian American and Pacific Islander women in elected office. How does that start to reflect changes in how we've thought of Asian American political participation? And, how might we actually build on that, especially in the face of such efforts as voter suppression bills and continued efforts to kind of say, you actually are not Americans, you don't belong here.
I think we've seen huge progress. I've been so emboldened and just heartened by the kind of progress we've seen, and who would have thought? I certainly never would have thought that the first woman elected to the second highest office in this country would actually be a woman of color, of South Asian heritage, and Black as well. That has been a pivotal and transformative moment, I think. And I think the reason we're seeing a lot more AAPI women running for office is because, we, like our African American sisters here, have faced very similar issues around the intersectionality of racial identity, ethnic identity, and gender. And we know that in order to make any meaningful change, we have to be a part of the process. And that was the one real insight that hit me the hardest. In 2017, when we heard talks of the Muslim ban and the Trump administration was moving decisively in that area, we had a lot of great allies, people who would come to our Muslim communities and say, we hear you, we see you, we're going to protect and represent you. And I looked around the room and I thought, we need to be doing some of this work ourselves. We need to be representing ourselves. And I think a lot of us have had that shared idea that we do have a responsibility to speak for ourselves. And there's some issues on which we understand the community and the concerns that we face, and that we have the obligation then to be a part of the process to bring change, to bring transformation. And until we do, then we won't see the kind of changes that we want to see. And so I think that's all played a part of it. We're fortunate in Virginia now, just within the past month, we've established the first AAPI caucus in the General Assembly, because there are 5 of us, finally.
Yeah.
There's the 4 delegates and then myself in the Senate. And so we've been able to, because now we can actually represent these communities. And I think that's an important first step for so many of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us this evening for our weekly Asian American Herald show. And so once again, I'm Hamani Gupta Carlson, and I've been speaking with Virginia State Senator Ghazala Hashmi. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook and YouTube-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community among Asian Americans. So thank you all for joining us. Please continue to send us your story ideas and look for a recording of the show on our Facebook page. Have a good evening. We'll see you all again next Thursday. And thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.